Let us begin. So we read this next part here, but let's examine it more closely. I'll introduce this by saying there are many girsaot in this particular Gemara, and we will not go into all of them. I would like to get through the one that we have as best we can, and we may also look at some other Rishonim. But so this was the story, and it was kind of a story. Ze'era bar Chama ushpizachnin Rabbi Yassi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Tukuhu Rabbanan de Kesare Abba. Ze'era bar Chama was the host for Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and all of the Rabbanan of Kesaria. Amarle, so Zera said, Rav Yosef Bered Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So he said to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's son, Bar Arya, son of Eli, Ta emalach miltam ali malyata dahava avid avuch. Let me tell you this wonderful thing that your father did. Mitpachat hayalo be'erev Yom Kippurim. He had a cloth on Erev Yom Kippur, v'shoreh ota b'mayim. He soaked it in water. V'yoseh ota kamin kelim neguvim. And he made it like dry clothing, which I interpreted as meaning that he wrung it out. And so he soaked it and then wrung it out. The next day, he would wipe his hands, his face, his hands, and his legs with it. That's what he did on Erev Yom Kippur. So let's just bear in mind. So again, so he took a cloth, he would soak it, and then wring it out. And in the next day, on the day of Yom Kippur, he would use it to wipe his hands, his face, and his legs. So as we said last time, this is still in the overall discussion about Rechitza on Yom Kippurim. Rechitza l'ta'anug is asur. We also learned last week that there's this idea of not sitting on something, lav dafka sitting, but that's the example it's brought, but not sitting on something that is so wet that when it makes something else, that when it makes something wet, that the second thing can also make something wet. So here, following in that, this would seem to be a case that avoids that issue. That is, we have a soaked cloth, but we make sure to wring it out before Yom Kippur, so that when it comes into contact with our skin, it's not going to actually give off water. It's not going to give off moisture. But why would we do it? Why would Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi do this?
To cool down.
Presumably to cool down. Again, in the same context, it seems like something he would do to cool down. Erev Tisha B'Av. So what did he do on Erev Tisha B'Av? Shoreh ota b'mayim. He would take that mitpachat, he would soak it in water, u'machar ma'avira al gabei einav. And the next day, he would pass it over his eyes. So let's stop here. So what's the difference between what he did on Erev Yom Kippur to what he did on Erev Tisha B'Av?
Actually, two differences.
Okay.
One is that on Erev Yom Kippurim, he would wring it out, whereas he would not do that on Erev Tisha B'Av.
Mm-hmm.
Second difference is that on Yom HaKippurim itself, he'd rub it over his face, his arms, and his legs.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Tisha B'Av, it only describes him putting it over his eyes.
Right. So before we go on, if this was all we had, let's just examine this by itself. So why would do what he did on Erev Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur, and why would he do something different? Why would he do this other thing on Erev Tisha B'Av and Tisha B'Av?
So presumably, if he wrings out the cloth on Erev Yom Kippur, and presumably by the next day it's at the most damp, and maybe not even that. It's not like a rechitza.
Okay, not like Rechitza. Okay.
Which is forbidden on Yom Kippur.
Okay.
And I'm honestly a bit mystified by the example from Tisha B'Av. So since Rechitza is also forbidden on Tisha B'Av, but this certainly sounds a lot like Rechitza.
Okay, Michael Schwartz, do you have any comments?
The only thing I can think of is that on Tisha B'Av, it's because it's not wrung out. Maybe it's wetter, so that's why he only limits it to his eyes instead of his whole body or his limbs and his face.
Okay.
However, no, actually, no, never mind. I was wondering if on Tisha B'Av, because it's D'Rabbanan, the action of Rechitza is not read so stringently.
Okay, so yeah, so let's talk about some of these factors. So one of the factors is that Rechitza is asur both on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av. That's to begin with. They're both asur. But the Isur of Rechitza on Yom Kippurim is Dioraita, and on Tisha B'Av it's D'Rabbanan. So we might expect that there's something that's more kal about the way he behaved on Tisha B'Av as opposed to Yom Kippur. So that's one thing. There's another thing, which is so on Erev, and in this girsa, in this version, it says that on Erev Tisha B'Av he soaked it in water, but as Michael Warder pointed out, he didn't wring it out. So there's another difference between Tisha B'Av and Erev Yom Kippur, between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, and that has to do with a sort of schita. So you're not allowed to wring out clothing on Yom Kippur, but there's no isur of wringing out clothing on Tisha B'Av, even to the extent that on Tisha B'Av we say you shouldn't do melacha, but it's not an isur melacha in the same way that it's an isur melacha on Yom Kippur. When we talk about not doing melacha on Tisha B'Av, it's just this idea that because you're in mourning, you refrain from doing your regular work. But it's not the lamed tet malachot that are asur on Shabbat and Chagim. So we can understand that on Erev Yom Kippur, he wrings out the cloth first because he'll want to handle it on Yom Kippur. And if it's too wet, then he won't be able to use it for wiping anything. He won't be able to handle it because he'll be afraid that he'll be squeezing it out. On Tisha B'Av, he doesn't have to worry about squeezing it out, but he does still presumably have to worry about the Rechitza. So given that, so why would it be that on Yom Kippur, in the Yom Kippur example, he uses it to wash his face, his hands, and his legs, and on Tisha B'Av, he only uses it to go over his eyes. And also, I just want to point out there's a difference right in the language, because on Yom Kippur, it's mikaneach. So mikaneach would be to wipe. That implies a certain amount of pressure that he's using, like he's actually wiping down his face, his hands, and his legs. On Tisha B'Av, he only goes over his eyes. It implies that he's not pushing so hard. So why would it be then that so why is it that on Yom Kippur he goes over panav yadav v'raglav, and on Tisha B'Av he only goes over his eyes?
So I would guess that if in fact the cloth is dry or nearly dry, there's not any appearance of rechitza. Whereas on Tisha B'Av, since it's wet, there's an appearance of, it either is rechitza or there's an appearance of rechitza. And therefore just resting passively over his eyes is presumably not so clearly like rechitza as wiping.
Okay, so and then why only over his eyes? Why not also his hands and his legs? Bearing in mind that Tisha B'Av, as we said, we would think that it's more kal. So there's a tzad kula here because he's using a washcloth that's not fully wrung out, that's still presumably wet, like more noticeably wet, but he only passes it over his eyes. So why only over his eyes and not on his hands, his feet, and his legs?
I would guess that the eyes are already moist, so there's no real change happening.
Well, listen, there's this idea, right? We say a bracha every morning, Hamavir Shena Me'enai, and there is this idea of removing the sleep from your eyes. It's one of the things that we do in the morning, and as when we talked a little bit a few shiurim ago about doing Netzilat Yadayim in the morning, that according to the understanding of the Gemara, you're not supposed to touch your eyes before you wash in the morning. We also pointed out that washing that's not for ta'anug is permitted even on Yom Kippur, and would also be permitted on Tisha B'Av. But remember here, as you pointed out earlier, it would seem that the whole point of having this cloth is really probably to cool down. It's not, so when we're not doing it to wash per se, we're doing it maybe for this idea that we want to be able to cool down if it's a hot day. So nonetheless, it comes out that on Tisha B'Av, he only goes over his eyes and he doesn't press it. So the idea that he wouldn't press it, that he's just ma'avir, right? He just passes it over his eyes. So presumably that's because this is actually a wet cloth. If he presses on it, then that would be rechitza. That would be some kind of rechitza that would just be for ta'anug. But to pass it over his eyes, maybe to help just to remove the, I don't know what you call them, right? The little things that are in your eyes in the morning. Then maybe that would be enough, or maybe it's not even for that. Maybe it's just as a way of refreshing himself to pass it over his eyes. But the reason that the reason he doesn't pass it over his hands and his leg is not immediately clear, or even the rest of his face. It's not immediately clear, but it would seem that there's a tzad chumrah, that is, I'm going to be more machmir on Tisha B'Av. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is more machmir on Tisha B'Av, in that he'll only use this cloth on his eyes and nowhere else. But there's also a tzad kula, which is that he's using a cloth that's still wet, like more noticeably wet than the one that he wrung out on Erev Yom Kippurim. So let's just keep that in mind. But now let's look at the next version. Rabba Bar Meri Amar. So when Rabba Bar Meri came, he said, and now he's also giving testimony about this behavior of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. They're all talking about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and what he did. So now he's going to say, this is what I saw Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi do. בערב תשעה באב מביאים לו מטפחת, ושורה אותה במים, ומניחה תחת מרשותיו, ולמחר מקנח פניו, ידיו, ורגליו. So he said, I saw what he did is that he would take a cloth, he would, on Erev Tisha B'Av, he would soak it in water, he would put it under his head, and the next day he would mikaneach, he would wipe his face, his hands, and his legs. בערב יום הכיפורים מביאים לו מטפחת, ושורה אותה במים, ועושה אותה כמין כלים נגובים, ולאחר מעבירה על גבי עיניו. So he would take, on Erev Yom Kippur, he would take a mitpachat, he would soak it, he would wring it out, and then the next day he would pass it over his eyes. So now, of course, what changed in this testimony?
It's opposite now. On Yom Kippur, he's only wiping his eyes, whereas on Tisha B'Av, he's doing his limbs and his face.
So first of all, what he does with the cloth is reversed. In this version, he wipes his hands, his face, his hands, and his legs on Tisha B'Av, and on Yom Kippur, he only passes it over his eyes. And the rest of it is essentially the same, except that in this version, on Erev Tisha B'Av, he takes the cloth and soaks it in water, and he puts it under his head. That's something that he didn't, that wasn't brought down in the first version. But setting that aside, it's essentially the version that Zera brought, but in reverse. That the things that he does with the cloth on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av are the things that Zera said he did on the other days, on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. And so here, in this case, in Yom Kippur, then he's altogether machmir. That is, there isn't a tzad kula and a tzad chumra. It's legamre lechumra. That he takes the cloth and he wrings it out, and the only thing that he does with it the next day is to pass it over his eyes. Whereas in the Zeira version, he used it to wipe down his face, his hands, and his legs. And in Tisha B'Av, he takes it, he takes the cloth, he soaks it, he doesn't wring it out, but he puts it under his head. Why would he put it under his head?
Presumably just to cool himself off at night.
Yeah, so I think it accomplishes two things. One is that it's going to keep him cool at night. The other thing is that it will also contribute to lessen, it doesn't wring it out, but it's going to be less wet in the morning than if he had just left it out, because it'll be under pressure. In any event, so now we have these two versions of what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi did. So before we go on, as we said when we were talking in the beginning, so presumably the idea here is it's falling in line with these things that we brought in the previous part of the sugya about things that you can do on Yom Kippur to cool off, right? So like you're allowed to take a fruit and rub it against you, or you're allowed to take a child and hold him against you, or things like that. And you're allowed to expose yourself, or put on your skin things that will cool you, provided that you're not washing. If it involves water, then it could be washing, or close enough to washing that it would be like rechitza l'ta'anug. But you're allowed to take things that are cool to cool off on Yom Kippur. And now we're contrasting that with things that you can do on Tisha B'Av. So now we have these eduyot, we have these testimonies from Zera and from Rabbi Bar Meri about what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi did. And we find out that we know he did something. We know he did something with a cloth, both on Erev Yom Kippur and on Erev Tisha B'Av. But of course now, because we have two conflicting testimonies, we're not exactly sure which one he did when. And then the last lines of this are Amar le Rabbi Yaakov or Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa. Yivcha amart lan. Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, you told us the opposite. So one of the things that I've been trying to figure out as I've gone through this over the last couple of weeks is, so Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa have not been mentioned until now. Right, so the first version is by this fellow Zera bar Chama, who's the host of rabbis. And the second one is Rabbi Bar Meri, who was one of the Rabbanim, who wasn't mentioned in the first cohort, but he obviously also knew Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And now we have these two people that weren't mentioned before at all. And what does it mean? Rabbi Yaakov says to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, Ifcha Amartan. You told us the opposite. So what did he tell them? Hold on a second. In other words, if it had said that Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Bar Meri, you told us the opposite, or if he'd said to Zera, you told us the opposite, then I understand it. But Ma pitom Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, Ma pitom Rabbi Yaakov. So I don't know. And I started, I didn't see anyone so far who brought this up. Like, who are these people and why are they in this sugya? But it's also interesting. I looked at the Friedberg manuscripts, the Hafikar Sinan, where they have about 7 or 8 different girsaot in the Gemara. You look at them, but and even though there are different girsaot, but this is consistent that we have the first version from Ze'era, and we have the second version from Rabbi Bar Meri, and then we have this last part with these two people, and there's some variations in the names here also, but basically It's different people. So what I take it to indicate is that this testimony about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was widely known. A lot of people knew about what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi did, but there were different versions of what he did as these things happen, right? So when Rabbi Yaakov says to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, you told us the opposite. First of all, we would not to know what was the thing that he said and what was its opposite, because we already have two versions of what was said. But in terms of the people themselves being involved in the discussion, I think this is what it means. It just means that Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa also had a version of what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi did. And maybe it was like the most recent one, the one of Rabbi Bar Mary, the one that just was brought in the Gemara. And Rabbi Yaakov is saying to him, you told us the opposite. So now we have an idea, of course, of what the opposite is, because in the two versions that we have, the main thing that's opposite between the versions is what he did with the cloth on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av respectively. Then in the first version, on Yom Kippur, he wipes his face, his hands, and his legs. And in the second version, he passes it over his eyes. In the first version, on Tisha B'Av, he only passes it over his eyes. In the second version, he wipes his hands, his face, his legs. So he says, Ivcha Amartlan. So what we can understand is he's saying, whichever version now, we'll try to figure out which version he saw that he was talking about. He says, you told us the opposite, Otivnach, and I asked a kasha on you, Schita. It's squeezing out. So in which version is there first of all, when is there a problem of Schita? Again.
Only on Yom Kippur.
Only on Yom Kippur. Schita is only an issue on Yom Kippur. It's not an issue on Tisha B'Av. You're allowed to take cloths and rinse them out and squeeze them out on Tisha B'Av, provided, like, if you're wearing rubber gloves, you would be allowed to do that. So he's saying, I asked you a kasha mishum schita. So now, which version do we have? We have the version of Yom Kippur where he wipes his face, his hands, his legs. And we have the version where he passes it over his eyes. Excuse me, which version is more likely to be an issue of schita?
The second version, because you had said that wiping one's eyes, it's less pressure, whereas once one starts doing other parts of the body, there's the possibility of more pressure, and then schita. But on Yom Kippur, the rag has already been squeezed out.
Oh, so then what? Okay, but so that's why I say which one is more likely to have a problem of schita? But it's still going to be the one where he's mekaneach. That would be the first version. In the first version, he's on Yom Kippur, he's mekaneach, right? Kinuach implies, like I said, implies that he's wiping, implies that there's more pressure involved. So then if that's true, so maybe that we could, so what's the point? Then it could be that he's saying that in the case, hold on a second. Sorry, my throat is very dry, more than usual. So, okay. So it would go, it would, let me put it like this. In the second version, on Yom Kippur, he only passes the cloth over his eyes. And now, if Rabbi Yaakov is saying that's the version, right? This is the version that Rabbi Yirmiyah told him. He's saying, Ifcha Amartla, you told us the opposite, then the opposite would be where he takes the cloth and wipes his hand, his face, his hands, and his arms, and his legs. And I asked a kasha on that of schita. So that it kind of fits in. So what would be the kasha from schita? The kasha would be, even though this cloth has been wrung out, and even though it's sat overnight, but there could still be an issue of schita. It could still be moist enough that you shouldn't use it for wiping. Now, that's what, this is a way we could put together this sugya. Let's see what Rashi says. So Rashi, back in the beginning of the sugya, right, he says that in the case where Zera brings the first case, he says, your father, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, had a mitpachat. Rashi says, mitpachat sudar kamin kelim neguvim. It's a sudar. It's a, it's like a scarf, or it's another word I'm looking for, but I can't think of. We'll just say scarf. Kamin kelim neguvim, but as if it's been wrung out. Bani shamati. So Rashi says, ani shamati dahachi garsina. I heard that this is the proper girsa. Erev Yom Kippurim miviyin lo mitpachat u'mekaneach ba'yadav u'machar poshta u'ma'avira al einav v'hilach k'tzat mekinuach hayadayim de'etmol. So Rashi's girsa here is actually, in other words, the girsa that Rashi heard is different even than the one we have in the Gemara. And what's the girsa here? That on Erev Yom Kippur, they brought him a mitpachat. So on Erev Yom Kippur, he didn't wring it out. But Rashi already said that a mitpachat implies that it's kemin kelim nikuvim. See, he's taking a wrung out cloth and he mekanech ba'yadav, and he wipes his hands with it. And then the next day, poshta, he opens it up, he spreads it out, and he just passes it over his eyes. And it's a little damp because it's been squeezed out from his hands yesterday. So this is how Rashi says that this is the way he has the girsa. Now, it's also not clear to me. It's also, that's what, again, I don't want to get too deeply in the weeds, but it's this girsa introduces things that weren't in either of the versions that we saw, right? Because he uses it on Erev Yom Kippur to wipe his hands. So in other words, it's already a sudar that's been wrung out, and he used it to wipe himself before Yom Kippur, before there would be an issue of shlita. And then on Yom Kippur itself, he just uses it to pass over his eyes. So that's like the Maviral Alainav, that's like the second version. That's like the Rabba Bar Meri version. Rashi, it's not clear to me when Rashi says Ani Shamati Dahachi Garsinan, if he means that on the Zeira version or in the Rabba Bar Meri version. It's not clear to me. which one it is, because between there and the end of the sugya, there is no other Rashi. So I'm not sure which one it refers to. Okay, let's see the second Rashi. Ivcha amart lan, b'tisha b'av, oseh otan kinin kelim v'kuvim, ube'erev Yom Kippurim lo amart, oseh otan kinin kelim v'kuvim. So the Ivcha, according to Rashi, is altogether different. That is, when Rabbi Yaakov says to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, you told me the opposite. He means, what was the opposite? In this version, he wrings out the cloth on Erev Yom Kippur, but he doesn't wring out the cloth on Erev Tisha B'Av. And Ivcha Amartlan, you told us the opposite, that Tisha B'Av oseh otan kimin kelim neguvim. That on told us the opposite, that on Tisha B'Av is when he made the cloth wrung out, but you didn't say that he wrung out the cloth on Erev Yom Kippur. So again, it's introducing. It's not the ifcha that we thought. It's a different ifcha. It's a different afuch. That's how Rashi understands ifcha amartlan, votivnach schita. And then I challenged you by saying schita. So let's understand that though. Then the schita but it would make sense. It would make more sense than what we said, in the sense that what we said, the ifcha is that that the ifcha would be the first version that Ze'era brought, where on Yom Kippur he's mikaneach with the mitpachat. So he's wiping in the first version, he's wiping with mitpachat. If that's the opposite, so we said that maybe that's still enough, there's still enough moisture, even though it's been wrung out, but because he's wiping, it would be a problem, because wiping might still elicit enough water that it would be like squeezing out. And here, in Rashi's understanding, it's that the ifcha was that on Erev Yom Kippur, he's saying to me, in the original way you told me this, on Erev Yom Kippur, he didn't wring out the cloth at all. So that on Yom Kippur, it will actually be wet. It'll be more wet than if he had wrung it out. And so that's why I asked Akasha, how could that have been? Because there would be schita. And so Rashi continues, says Lashon Sheshamati. This is a language that I heard. In other words, this what he just explained is what I heard. Hachikamar. And this is how I would understand it. Ifcha Martvan Erev Tisha B'Av Mikaneach Ba Yadav U'Lamachar Poshta. Remember, Rashi has in his Girsa from earlier Poshta U'Lamachar Poshta Ma'avira Alainav. Be'erev Yom Kippurim Shoreh Ota B'Mayim Yoseh Ota Kimin Kelim Neguvim V'Tivnach Schita. The kamin kelim neguvim adayin yesh kedei schita lislot. So Rashi says different than what I just said, where he's saying that actually the ifcha is going to be. You told us on Erev Tisha B'Av that he wipes his hands, right? This is what Rashi said earlier, except earlier, so here, it's like this. In Rashi's Girsa earlier, it says, Erev Yom Kippur, they would bring the mitpachat, and he would wipe his hands on Erev Yom Kippur. And the next day, he would open it up and pass it over his eyes. So what would be the ifcha? The ifcha would be Erev Tisha B'Av, Mikaneach B'Yadav, U'Machar Poshta, and then Ma'avira Einav. The Erev Yom Kippurim, then what would he do on Erev Yom Kippur? He would soak it in water, and he would wring it out. But still, the otivnach, still I would ask you the kasha of schita, that the kamin kelim neguvim adayin yesh kedei lischot. That even after he wrung it out, I will still tell you there's enough there that he could still wring out more, and there could still be a problem with schita. Okay, so you see why I didn't want to go into too many girsaot here, because as it is, we're contending with a lot just with what we have on the page. So, be that as it may, what do we get out of this? In other words, we want to be able to derive halacha l'maaseh from here. So what are we left with? We have conflicting versions of the same story within the Gemara, and then we already introduced alternate girsaot in Rashi. But what's the bottom line? What are we actually going to be allowed to do and not allowed to do? So let's take a look. As you can see, we could spend a lot of time going through this, and as I say, because there are other girsot, I even prepared a sheet with the Rif and some of the Rishonim on the Rif that talk about this. I'm not going to bring them in because it's a little bit more than we have to get into. But let's look at the tour. Wait, too far here. Let's look at the Rambam and we'll look at the tour. So this is the Rambam in Hilchot Shvitat Asor, Perek Gimel, and he says, "Loker chadam mitpachat me'erev Yom Kippurim, v'shoreh ota b'mayim, u'menag ba ma'at, u'menicha tachat habgadim, u'lemachar ma'avira al panav ve'eino choshesh, v'af al pi sheyesh ba kor harbe." So Rambam understands, here, you know what, before we see that Rambam, let's look at the previous one. So this is just, because it goes in the order that we did the sugya. Tit shehulach bioter. If you have tit, right, so it's like wet clay, right, that's very wet. Kadesh yaniach adam yado Allah v'ta'aleh ba'alach luchit she'im hidbik ota liyado ha'acheret tidbak ba'alach luchit. It's so wet that if a person puts his hands on it and it gets wet from contact with his hand, and then if he sticks that hand to his other hand, the other hand would also become wet. If it's that wet, that's the tofeach habenatat biach. Asur le'shev alav. You're not allowed to sit on it. Lo yimalei adam kli cheres mayim v'yitztanein ba. You shouldn't. A person is not allowed to fill up a clay vessel with water to cool off with. Shehamayim nozlim midofna, because the water is going to leak out through its side. Afilu kli matchot asur, and he's not even allowed to use a metal kli with water. Because maybe some of the water is going to spill onto his flesh. You're allowed to pull yourself off with peirot. So that we understand all that from the previous sugya. And in light of that, then he brings the sugya that we're doing. So the sugya that we're doing, this is how the Rambam concludes for Yom Kippur, that you can take a mitpachat on Erev Yom Kippur, you can soak it, you can dry it a little bit. So you squeeze it out a little bit. So you don't have to squeeze it out entirely. You can squeeze it out somewhat. And you can put it under clothes. So now we didn't see that, but maybe that was in the Rambam's Girsa. We had in the second version, Tachan Merashotav on Tisha B'Av, but Naniach. What's the point of putting it under clothes? You have this wet cloth, and now you're going to put it under clothing, under Tachan Kadim, under other cloths. What would be the point?
It might keep the cloth colder, also wetter overnight.
So I think it actually does two things. I think it's going to keep it colder because it will insulate it. I think it makes it less wet because if the other clothes are dry, it's going to absorb some of the wetness. So I think it accomplishes both of those things. And then the next day, ma'abira, he doesn't say mikaneach, right? And it's only al panav. He doesn't say nav, he says al panav. Ve'no choshesh, but you can pass it over your face, even though it's very cold, right? So that fits into the idea that he put it tachat begadim to keep it cool. So the next day it's cold, so he can pass it over his face. Okay, so we understand this without going into all the girsot and so forth, but this is how the Rambam understood our sugya. And again, we see it. We see how the Rambam brings it down. It's exactly in line with this idea of what are you allowed to put against your skin on Yom Kippur to keep cool. So this is what the Rambam says. This is something you can do. Let's see halacha l'maaseh. Let's look at the tour. So the Tur says, "Mutar lihitztanen betit afu pi sheyesh bo k'tzat lachluchit." So the Tur starts with the thing with the teeth. He starts from the other side, and the way it's introduced in the Gemara, and the way the Rambam introduces it, is the Gemara starts from the idea of teeth that's tofeach al menat latpiach. But the Tur says, what does that imply? If the teeth is not tofeach al menat latpiach, you would be allowed to sin it. In other words, if it's a little bit damp, that's okay, and that's where he starts from. So he says you're allowed to cool off with teeth. He doesn't say how you're mitztanein betit. It means presumably you can put it anywhere. You don't have to just sit on it. If you want, like you could put your hands on it. You could put, maybe put your face against it. Even if it's a little bit damp, you're allowed to do that. But if it's so damp, so if it's tofeach amanat latpiach, that's not permitted. And then he goes on, Rambam left out tinok, you notice. But the Tur says you're allowed to cool off with peirot or patinok, kelim harekim, in any kind of empty vessel. So here he makes it clear because the Gemara used this term chaser, which we understood ultimately meant that it could be a kli that had water, but it didn't have a lot of water. So he says rekim. If the kelim are empty, then you're allowed to cool off with them, meaning you're allowed to press them against your skin. If they have water, feel a non-maleim asur. If they have water, even if they're not full, it's not permitted. Loshna shel cheres, loshna shel kesef. It doesn't matter whether they're clay or whether they're silver. Why? Because in both events, Shema Yitna'anu v'yishpoch min hamayim alav. Because maybe they'll move and the water will fall on him. Some people say you're not allowed to use a kli cheres even if it's empty, because they have absorbed a lot. And when you cool off with them, so he goes further than what we understood from the Gemara, but it's also a pshat in the Gemara, because maybe chaser, when it's talking about kli pachra, mana de pachra, means, even if it doesn't have water in now, but it held water before, you would still not be allowed to use it, because there's still going to be enough dampness that will come through the sides that if you put it against your face, it would be like washing. So that's that. Maybe we'll just to finish off, let's see how the Shulchan Aruch says, which is very similar to the tour, just so we get the halacha l'maaseh. So the Shulchan Aruch starts. I think I've lost 2 out of 3 here. Oh well. Asur hitzdanen betitlach. You're not allowed to cool yourself off with damp teat. Right? If it's so damp that it can make something else damp. Asur hitzdanen b'chelim sheyesh behem mayim, afilu hem chaserim. So here he uses the terminology we saw in Gemara. You're not allowed to cool off with kelim that have water in them, even if they're missing. In other words, even if they're not full of water. Bein shel cheres, bein shel matachot, avalim heim rekim. But if they're empty, then it's permitted. V'chein beferot uvetinok, and similarly with fruit and with a child. So the Ramah says, Haggah, V'asur lishtrot mapa mibod yom v'la'asota kamin kelim neguvim l'hitzdanen ba b'yom ha'kippurim v'chashinan shema lo tingov yafeh v'yavo lidei schita. So here he, in a clear reference to the sugya that we just did in the Gemara, he says, this whole idea of taking a mapa on Erev Yom Kippur, and even if you squeeze it out, he says, you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to take a cloth on Erev Yom Kippur and squeeze it out to use to cool off on Yom Kippur, because we are concerned, maybe you didn't squeeze it out well, and then you'll come to do schita on Yom Kippur. In other words, he's not so much worried about rechitza. In this is the first time I think that this becomes more clear. And I think this is what it means. Ultimately, if you put something damp against you that's not so, it's not tofeach hamanat, if it's only a little bit damp, then it's not really so much like washing. And maybe the only reason you're doing it isn't, your intent isn't to wash anyway. Your intent is just to cool off. But maybe it's damp enough that you'll be over on schita. There's still going to be a problem of schita in Yom Kippur. And he finishes up by saying, a choler can wash as his normal way, even if he's not a choler that's in danger. So let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says. He says, Lav dafke biyadayim. they shave, right? So the Mishnah Berurah brings it back to the Gemara because the Shulchan Aruch just says litztanei b'tidlach. He doesn't say to sit on it. He says it's not necessarily just in your hands to cool off your hands, but you could even sit on it. But tam kevan sheyesh bo tofech amanat latpiach over halachluchit umitaneg ulahachi asur. Gemara, where he's quoting for, he's bringing from the Gemara. And the problem with tofech amanat latpiach is because that would give you pleasure, and that's asur. That would give you pleasure, and he doesn't use the words, but we understand it, give you pleasure by way of something that's like rechitza. And then about the kelim that are chaserim, the kol shekein meleim, sheyesh lachu sheyitzu hamayim alav. Right? Certainly you're not allowed to take and cool off with full cups or full vessels of water because we're afraid that the water will spill on you. And then finally, this idea of taking a mitpachat and squeezing it out and so forth, we're afraid that maybe you did. The Ramah says you can't take a cloth, squeeze it out the day before, and then use it on to cool off on Yom Kippur because we're afraid that you'll come to Shlita. But the Mishnah Berurah says, "Aval mutar lekaneach yadav v'raglav erev Yom Kippur b'mapa u'lemachar ma'avira aleinav." He brings it back to what was the last version in the Gemara. He says you are actually allowed to take a cloth on erev Yom Kippur, and wipe your hands, your face, and your legs with it. And then the next day, you can pass it over your eyes. Even though it's still a little damp. Here we're not afraid of Shlita, which seems to run counter to, if you remember Rashi, in the way Rashi finished off, that maybe even after the kelim have been squeezed out, then maybe there'll still be a problem of Shlita. But he's saying if you already, you used the cloth, you actually used it to wash your hands, your face, and your legs on Erev Yom Kippur, then on the next day we'll assume that that the lachluchit that was in it, the dampness that was in it, is mostly gone because you already used it on your body. So the little bit that's left, you can use it to put on your eyes. Okay. So I think that's enough of this discussion. As I say, you can really go into this. There's some very interesting comments, and it is interesting how the Girsaot go back and forth. At least I find the whole thing interesting. Again, also because, like I said, I was a little puzzled. I'm still puzzled about the way it's brought down in the Gemara in the end with Rabbi Yaakov, who says to Rabbi Yosef bar Tachlifa, who are all these people and why are they talking about, how did they all get introduced? But I guess what you get out of it is that people did do different things to try to stay cool on Yom Kippur. And it raises all these interesting questions along the way. So now, we live in a time when nowadays it's not as relevant because we're fortunate to have artificial means of cooling like fans and air conditioners, things that people hadn't considered. But the other thing is just this idea of to what degree do I have to avoid coming into contact with water on Yom Kippur? To what extent do I have to worry about that? Okay, so this is basically where we're going to end. The only thing I wanted to tell you for next week, let me get back to that screen. I've already lost Michael and Paul, so I don't want to really get into this, but I just want to introduce you to an idea that we'll look into next time if you want. The first part of the sugya here is going to deal with an issue in the Chorot. I don't know if you looked ahead already. I'll just read the beginning. Amar Rav Menashe bar Tachlifa, Amar Rav Amam, Amar Rabba bar Bar Chana, Shalu et Rabbi Elazar. Okay, so these various Amorim, they asked Rabbi Elazar. They asked him a question. They asked him a halachic question. Zakein v'yoshev b'yeshiva tzarich litol reshut lahatir b'chorot o eino tzarich. Someone who is an elder who sits in the yeshiva. In other words, he's a recognized elder of his generation. Does he need to take permission? Does he need to get permission to be matir b'chorot? So, or does he not have to? So we're going to go, to understand the question, we have to understand a number of things, right? What does it mean to be matir b'chor? Why does somebody have to get permission to do that? And why would a zaken yoshev b'yeshiva be an exception to that rule? So, if you want, you can. Normally I would do this now, but I think we're going to stop this year. But I'll tell you, if for those of you who are still awake, you can look at. You can take time and look at this yourself in advance. 1 second. Yeah. If you haven't learned Bechorot before, look at the Rambam in Bechorot, Perek Aleph. Bechorot is in the Mishnah Torah under Sefer Korbanot. And just read, even if you don't understand everything, but you'll get a basic idea of what's at stake. And the basic idea, of course, is that in the mitzvah of Bechor Behema, you're supposed to give your firstborn Behema, it's supposed to be given to the Kohen. He's supposed to eat it as a korban. It's a korban shlamim. But if it has a mum, if it has a certain type of imperfection, then it has a different din, and you're allowed to eat it, but not as a korban. So what you need to understand is that there's going to be there's an underlying assumption that because it's more convenient to eat the bechor that has a mum, you don't have to. It doesn't need all of the procedures that a korban needs. That people will want to stack the deck or even do underhanded things to maybe give a mum to a bechor, or to declare that the bechor had a mum. And so therefore, for that reason and for other reasons, it's important that the mum is determined by an expert. There has to be an expert who determines what the mum is. And what we'll find out in the beginning of Perek Gimel, the Rambam explains, Ein shochtin et bechor ela pi mumchesh natan lo hanasi shebe'eretz Yisrael reshut. You don't shech the bechor on the word of an expert, in other words, somebody who looked at it and said, this is a mum, for which you shech the bechor. It has to be from a mumche that was specifically authorized by the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael, which the Nasi of the Sanhedrin had to authorize somebody to make that call. Yamarlo, and he said to him, Heter b'chorot b'muma, right? That he has authorization to make this kind of call. Afilu hayamum gadol v'galui l'chol, even if it was an obvious mum, like if it was missing an eye or if its leg was broken. Those are obvious mumim that even a child would understand, but nonetheless, lo yatiru ela mumchesh natal rashu. You can't make the bechor permitted for regular use, except by permission from a mumche. And a person who is a mumche, he can look at, in other words, he can look and determine mumim on any bechor, except if the bechor belongs to him. Then somebody else has to look at it. So this is a digression from Hilchot Yom Kippurim, and it's a digression in the Gemara also. The reason the Gemara is bringing this question in our Gemara is because they asked Rabbi Elazar this question, but then they asked him a question about wearing certain types of shoes on Yom Kippur, and that's the second part. But I'm not going to skip this part. It's not that long, and it's kedai to digress and understand a little bit about Chora. So that's where we'll pick up next time. And that's it for today. So have a good Shabbos.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye. Kol tu.